Hey there, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. It's been over a week since I've said anything out loud, not even a whisper. I don't waste sound unless it serves a purpose. There's no one around to talk to, and I don't need to hear myself think. Most of the time, I forget what my voice even sounds like. That's fine. Talking's a liability in a place like this, especially when the infected outside don't need much to catch a trail. The loft wasn't built for living. It was just a raised platform over the old prep room behind the supermarket deli, probably meant for storage before everything fell apart. It wasn't finished. Exposed beams, no guardrail, open to the air vents above. First time I crawled in, I did it through a busted utility shaft after a windstorm peeled part of the roofing sheet open. I nearly broke my wrist getting up here. It's cramped and smells like rusted copper from the wet pipes, but I keep it dry with canvas tarps I pulled from the hardware aisle. I sleep on 2 layers of insulation rolls wrapped in thick wool, and I've rigged up a shelf for food cans, bottles, and scavenge supplies. I run traps across most of the supermarket floor, noise alarms, crude blockades, pressure lines made from broken shelf runners. They're meant to slow down the infected or anyone who tries to get too curious. Maybe for 6 or 8 months, I kept to myself. Didn't climb down unless I had to. Didn't open anything I couldn't reseal. I took what I needed. Never more. The infected were always thick around here, drawn in by the old quarantine camp out back. That place went under fast. Looked official for weeks. Then the fences started sagging, and the tent started burning. I watched the soldiers pack up a truck and leave during a night storm. After that, the place rotted. The bodies never got buried. You can smell the dirt out there when the wind shifts. The supermarket is still mostly intact. Some of the roof leaks, and the front glass is all shattered or boarded up, but the structure's solid. There's still food, stuff people overlooked or couldn't carry. The frozen section's useless, and most of the good meat spoiled ages ago, but there's canned goods tucked behind collapsed displays and under the checkouts. I don't go for it unless I have a clean path. I know the floor layout better than anyone alive. Week ago, I thought this place would stay quiet. But then, a group came through the south corridor. 4 of them. 2 women, a man, and a boy. The kind of group that hasn't been on the road long enough to lose hope, but has seen enough to be wary of anything that moves. They weren't loud, but they weren't exactly careful either. They made it through the entrance without triggering my outer lines. I stayed hidden and watched them settle in around the snack aisle. One of the women had a firefighter's coat with half the reflective striping burned away. Looked like it had been patched with duct tape. The man carried shotgun, but the action stuck every time he pumped it. I heard the misfire clicks from up in the duct vent. He still carried it like it worked, maybe just to keep up appearances. The kid didn't say much. He moved close to the older woman, probably his mother. They camped near the pharmacy section, lit a small flame behind the steel desk by the clinic room, and rotated watch in a way that said they'd done this a few times before. I didn't move, didn't drop anything, just watched. I don't intervene when strangers pass through. It's a rule I set early on. Stay unseen, stay out of reach. Trust gets people killed faster than hunger or infection, but something shifted a few nights later. It was dark, and the wind had kicked up again, rattling the old HVAC units on the roof. I was half asleep when I heard the shouting. One of them calling out for someone. Short name, panicked tone. Caleb. I froze. That name isn't rare, but I haven't heard it since the day my little brother died. He was 10 when it happened. We were trying to make it out of the apartment building when the panic swept through. My mom had packed a bag. My brother reached for it when it slipped from her arms. He ran into the stairwell. One of the early infected, fast and still mostly human, grabbed him halfway down. I heard the thud, and then the silence. I never saw him again. The voice shouting for Caleb brought that moment back so hard I almost kicked over a water bottle in my loft. I grabbed my pry bar and climbed out through the rear hatch, sticking close to the shadows above aisle 9. The boy, this new Caleb, had wandered off and gotten turned around. He crouched near a half-smashed pet food display, trying to stay quiet while one of the infected passed by, just 2 aisles down. This infected was slow, thin, jaw half unhinged and hanging open. One arm dangled by torn muscle, and its feet dragged like they were broken at the ankles. Still dangerous if you got too close, but not smart. It groaned once, veered toward the broken floor tiles, then kept walking into the toy section. The kid stayed still, breathing through his mouth, backpack pressed against his chest. I crouched behind a shelf and watched. He didn't panic, didn't cry. I don't know why, but that made me move. I scratched an old mark into the bottom shelf near him, a symbol I used when I mapped this place, a circle with a line through it, something to catch his eye. He noticed it after a few seconds, looked straight at it, then at the shelf behind it. I backed away before he saw me, made sure I didn't make a sound. A few minutes later, the others found him and pulled him into a side corridor. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I started adjusting some of my traps. Subtle changes. I didn't want to clear the place for them, just guide them a little. I moved the noisemakers away from the spots they'd started using for watch. I rerouted one of the trip lines near the service hallway so it wouldn't catch them if they made a quick exit. I added another can of food to the top shelf of aisle 3 where I knew the kid had been looking yesterday. A dented can of soup still sealed. Later that afternoon, Caleb came back through alone. He found the can, looked around slowly, never said anything, just pocketed it and walked back to the others. No celebration, no thank you, just quiet. I waited until the group turned in for the night. Their new pattern was to sleep in shifts. One person always watching from the pharmacy doorway with a small flashlight and a length of pipe or a fire axe across their lap. That light never pointed too high, never swept the shelves. Good instinct. They didn't know someone was above them, but they acted like danger was always close. That was smart. It was also rare. I returned to the loft without rushing, took off my jacket, and sat still for a long time. I had planned to rest, but I couldn't. My hands wouldn't stop picking at the dried seam on my glove, and my mind kept going backward. I hadn't thought about my old group in a long time. Honestly, I tried not to. But something about seeing that kid, his silence, the way he moved, even the shape of his damn shoes, kicked it all loose again. I started seeing their faces, started remembering that last week. I wasn't always alone. I fell in with a group in the second month after the outbreak. Not a big group, just 6 of us. 7 if you count that stray dog that followed us for a while. We weren't survivors in the way people like to think about it now. We were just the ones who didn't die right away. That was the only difference. We didn't have a name, or a banner, or a mission. We had no leaders, just arguments. We moved when the dead forced us to, ate whatever didn't stink, and slept wherever didn't leak. We weren't strong. We were just angry and lucky enough to still be breathing. There was Mason, the oldest, mid-40s, ex-security guard, or maybe just wore the uniform. He had a heavy flashlight and a pistol with only 3 bullets, but he liked to act like it was a full magazine. He wasn't brave. He just knew how to look calm. There was Tori and Sadie, both late 20s, always whispering when things got tense. They were sisters, or claimed to be. I never knew for sure. There was Coda, a mechanic who never fixed anything, but always said he could. And then there was Reese. Reese was about my age. We'd met on the 4th day, fighting over a pack of batteries at a hardware store. He won the fight, but shared the pack. He said he wasn't used to fighting for things. He worked at a music store before all this, tuning guitars and fixing amps. Said his hands were too soft for punching, but he kept trying. We traveled together for 5 weeks, talked a lot at first. Later, we didn't talk much at all. That group didn't end with an attack or a betrayal. Nothing dramatic like that. We broke down slowly. Cold nights, infected bites, and the sound of screaming in the distance that never stopped. Mason was the first to go. He took one of those bad injuries, the kind that doesn't bleed right away but turns purple at the edge. He tried to keep moving, but it got into his blood. One night he couldn't walk. We made him a shelter out of pallets and said we'd come back. We didn't. I still don't know if that was mercy or cowardice. Tori disappeared 2 nights after that. Just slipped out during a watch shift. Left her sister sleeping. No note, no trail. Sadie screamed when she realized. We found blood in the stairwell of the parking garage, but nothing else. I didn't ask questions. Neither did Reese. By then we had all stopped asking why. It was around that time we reached the outskirts of this zone. The army had set up roadblocks and corrals near the old strip malls. They weren't letting people through unless you had a stamp or a wristband. None of us did. One night we watched from an abandoned print shop as the guards turned away a family of 4. Minutes later, infected came through the other side and tore into the line. Nobody opened the gates. We stopped talking after that. Coda got caught in the mess 2 days later trying to siphon gasoline from an overturned bus near the perimeter. He wasn't fast, and he wasn't quiet. We watched the infected reach him. We didn't move. Reese muttered something I didn't catch, and went to sleep early that night. I didn't blame him. I didn't sleep at all. When we found this supermarket, it was mostly untouched. People had passed through, taken what was easy to carry, but no one had looted it properly. The infected presence in the area was too high, and the old quarantine camp had collapsed by then. Most survivors kept clear of anything that still had military signage, even if it was faded. We got in through the broken loading dock. Reese and I spent the first night dragging shelves and setting up blockades. I found the loft the next morning. At first, I just used it as a lookout point. Reese stayed down below, organizing supplies, and arguing with Sadie over what to eat next. I slept up top, didn't trust being on the ground anymore. I started keeping my own stash up here, quietly at first. Just a couple cans, 1 backup weapon, a map, some notes. I told myself it wasn't betrayal, just insurance. But it was more than that. I could feel it happening. The group was falling apart and I didn't want to fall with them. The final break came 2 weeks later when a small horde passed through. Not the fast ones, not the runners. Just 30 or 40 slow, rotted husks that had wandered in from the old tent camp. We were supposed to be quiet, hide, wait it out. Reese panicked, thought he could lead them away. He used himself as bait, ran through the aisles banging on carts, yelling like an idiot. It worked, for about 10 seconds. Then he tripped on a detergent bottle someone left on the floor. I was watching from the loft when he hit the tile. I had a clear shot with the pry bar. Could have made a noise, pulled them toward me, maybe given him a chance. But I didn't. I froze. I watched him crawl and scream, and then stop moving altogether. Sadie left the same night. I didn't stop her, just watched her pack her things and disappear into the parking lot. She didn't say anything, didn't look up. I stayed in the loft and listened to the silence settle back into the store like it never left. After that, it was just me. I stayed up top, kept quiet, reinforced the platform, and made sure the entrance was hard to find. The infected thinned out in the surrounding streets as the cold months wore on. Most of them stayed near the old camp, clinging to whatever drew them there in the first place. Maybe the smell, maybe something else. I stopped trying to figure out the rules. I just made new ones and followed them. I didn't leave unless I had to. I didn't talk. I didn't help anyone. Until now. This new group isn't like the one I came from. They don't trust each other fully yet. I can see it in their spacing when they sleep, the way they hide food. But they haven't broken yet. They still move like they want to survive together. Caleb sticks close to the older woman, his mother probably, but I've seen him looking at the broken shelves with curiosity. Not fear, that's rare. I started leaving hints, nothing too obvious, just small changes in the layout, a cleared path here, a stacked crate there. I repaired a piece of shelving near their sleeping area to act as a barricade, without making it obvious it was new. Left another can in a different aisle 2 nights ago. This time it was pears. No label, but sealed. I watched Caleb find it. He didn't smile, but he set it down in the center of the group's food pile. That's when I knew he understood it was a gift. Still, I haven't revealed myself. That would change everything. They'd either turn on me out of fear or start asking for more. Neither option helps anyone. This only works if I stay hidden. A ghost in the ceiling, helping from behind the walls. One wrong sound, one mistake, and the balance shifts. And balance is the only thing keeping this place together. I've lived long enough to know that people don't usually make it more than a few months in one spot. But if anyone's going to change that, it's this group. Or maybe just that boy. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. This store is still full of supplies. Not the easy stuff like snack bars or packaged meat. That's all been picked over years ago. But the deep stock, the locked back room near the janitor's office, and the seasonal overstock above the upper racks. Most of that is untouched. Not because people didn't try, but because it's in the part of the store where the infected still roam constantly. They come through the southeast breach, an opening torn wide when that army helicopter dropped out of the sky and ripped through the south-facing wall. That hole is still there, raw and gaping. Torn wires hang down from where light fixtures used to be, and daylight pours through the mess, drawing every moving shadow from the remains of the camp outside. There's no fence there anymore, no barricade. The infected just wander in, fall over broken furniture, get caught between shelves, or keep going until something stops them. Sometimes they make it all the way to the soda coolers. Sometimes they collapse halfway and rot into the tile. That part of the store stinks like grease and mildew, and something worse, something that clings to your tongue after you breathe it in. I don't go down there often, but I do go. My warehouse stash depends on it. I've learned to move slowly, quiet as dust, always low, never straight. I memorized every path with broken tile. I marked the soft ones with chalk. I reinforced an old maintenance cart with cloth and foam so I could drag it without sound. I go in alone, in the dark, just before sunrise, when the infected seem slowest. I never stay longer than 20 minutes. Most of what I collect are sealed cans, powdered mixes, and a couple of overlooked crates of cooking lard that I melted down into jars. I don't eat more than I need. One small meal a day, sometimes two if it's cold. I store everything in an old refrigeration locker buried under the produce floor. The compressor's dead, but it seals tight. Smell doesn't get out. Neither do rats. I keep that stash for emergencies. I don't touch it unless I have to. The real issue isn't food, it's water. The supermarket used to have large refill stations and bottled crates, but almost all of those are gone or ruptured. I've scrounged enough iodine tablets and bleach to purify runoff for a few months. But the real trick is gathering. That's where the roof comes in. The rooftop isn't safe. Not fully. It's flat and exposed, and if someone with binoculars or a rifle looked at the right angle from the ridgeline across the highway, they'd see anything moving up there. I avoid that. But there's one section near a crumpled ventilation system where the aluminum fan blades collapsed inward, creating a sort of blind spot from ground view. That's where I've built my rest space. It started with just a plastic chair and a camping mat. Then I added a folding table I found buried behind the gardening section. I anchored it to the roof with wire and wrapped it with black tarp to keep glare down. Now there's a cup with dice I carved from broken broom handles, a set of old darts I found in the sporting goods bin, and a corner where I lean my pry bar when I don't want it touching the roof membrane. I spend a few hours up there most days, always in the late afternoon when the wind is calm and the rooftop feels less exposed. I collect water from a drainage slope that feeds into a plastic drum I rigged up from salvaged tubing. It's not much, maybe a gallon every 2 days if the air's damp, but it adds up. I boil what I can inside, using a small canister stove I ration carefully. The heat is weak, but it works if I give it time. There's no plumbing left inside, so I built a wash station up there too. Just a bucket with a spigot I drilled and fitted myself. I wash every few days, cold water only, and not for long. I keep clean enough to avoid skin infections, but that's about it. The main thing is to have good hard soap, then it will wash away any dirt. Liquid soap is not suitable. I don't like it. My toilet is a plastic paint bucket with a lid, and a small trench of cat litter I rotate every other week. It's disgusting, but it's private and safer than wandering down into the customer restrooms, which are dark, broken, and too close to the infected zone. You only make that mistake once. I almost got cornered there early on. Haven't been back since. Some nights I sleep up top, in the blind spot near the fan duct. I never do it 2 nights in a row. The loft is safer, but it gets stuffy and hot if I don't crack the vent open. The roof gives me air, visibility, and a strange sense of space that the shelves and freezer walls can't offer. But there's a risk every time. Noise travels up, sound reflects. One dropped can, one scraped boot, and someone on the highway might hear. That's why I don't laugh. That's why I don't talk to myself. And it's why I always pocket the dice when I'm done playing. I never leave anything loose. Last night, I sat up there longer than usual. There was movement near the old freeway, too far to hear voices, but I could see shapes. At least 3 people, maybe 5. They weren't infected. Infected don't move in formation, and they don't carry flashlights. These people did. Faint red glow, controlled beams. Looked like a recon team or a supply crew. Might be part of one of the organized groups I've heard about. Might be worse. I've learned not to assume either way. I pulled the tarp tighter over my setup and didn't move for nearly an hour. Watched them pass, slow and steady, heading east. They didn't look at the store, didn't pause. I don't know if they saw it or not. I waited another full hour before going back inside. That's how it has to be. This morning, I watched Caleb again. He was stacking empty cans outside the pharmacy area, trying to build some kind of alert tower or alarm system. The others weren't helping. One of the women was arguing with the man in the fire jacket. I couldn't hear the words, but their body language said enough. He didn't like being told what to do. She didn't like being ignored. Caleb stayed out of it. That was smart. He kept working, kept quiet. I recognized the habit. Keep moving, keep busy, and do anything that stops people from staring at you for too long. It's not the infected that break a place like this. It's the tension, the doubt, the slow, ugly unraveling that comes when people realize there's no structure holding anything together, and everyone is depending on instincts that haven't fully adjusted to the world we live in now. I watched them from the loft while I ate a handful of cold beans out of a dented can, trying to ignore how thin the liquid had become from age. The group's voices drifted up from the pharmacy corridor, and their argument turned into a low, steady conversation that lasted longer than I expected. When they finally settled enough that I could hear more than tone, I moved closer to the duct slit over aisle 10. The angle gave me a clear line to the back of store corridor, where they always talked when they didn't want Caleb to listen. The man paced slowly with his hands stuffed inside the sleeves of his jacket. He was tall, heavy-set, with a way of walking that suggested old knee pain or a healed fracture. The woman he argued with kept her arms locked across her chest like she was cold or done listening. She wasn't his wife. She looked too young and carried herself too freely to be married to a guy who acted that rigid. After a while, their conversation made the relationships clear anyway. Her name was Lainey, short for Alana. She was the man's younger sister, and the man's name was Rick. The older woman, the one who mostly stayed with Caleb near the pharmacy shelves, was Rick's wife, Mara. They had been traveling together since the first spring after the outbreak, long after the military camp here had collapsed, but before the region became too dangerous for any large group to hold on. Lainey had been with them since day one. Mara joined later. Caleb was theirs, their son. Knowing that made the earlier argument make more sense. They weren't just tired travelers. They were people trying to keep a family intact while living in a building with no doors and hundreds of infected drifting within 100 yards of their sleeping bags. The conversation shifted into something calmer as Rick stopped pacing and leaned against a half-crushed soda refrigerator. Lainey spoke in a quieter tone now, explaining that their food supply had dropped to 3 days at best. She listed what they had: a few cans of preserved soup, dry oats that Caleb hated eating, and a single unopened tin of peaches. She said the supermarket looked full from a distance when they first arrived, but every aisle closer to the southeast breach smelled rotten or was picked clean. Rick answered her with something I already suspected. He said he had been scouting the closed section behind the janitor's corridor, the sealed-off stockroom where most of the unopened merchandise had been stored. He said he saw boxes stacked halfway to the ceiling, untouched pallets wrapped in plastic, and even a rolling cage of canned sauces that still looked sealed. The problem wasn't the doors. The problem was the infected. Rick said that entire section was thick with them. Maybe a dozen at first glance. Maybe more. They weren't wandering. They were standing, almost braced between shelves, barely moving except for the occasional twitch or sway. He said something about how he suspected the helicopter crash had caused a partial wall collapse behind the storage area, letting infected funnel directly into the confined space, but never letting enough light or sound through to draw them out. Laney asked if there was any chance of clearing it slowly or using noise to pull them away. Rick shut that down fast. He said any noise strong enough to lure them into one aisle would pull 50 more from outside through the breach. He wasn't wrong. I had learned the same lesson on my own. Noise was death here. Silence was survival. Mara appeared near the end of the conversation, joining them with a stiff walk and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair looked unwashed, tangled at the ends, and she pressed her palms together the way tired parents do when they're fighting panic in small breaths. She said Caleb hadn't eaten anything but half a can of soup and some crackers since yesterday. She asked Rick again whether they should consider moving on. He said no without hesitation. He said the supermarket had more potential than anything they'd passed in the last week. He said they just had to be patient. But patience didn't stop hunger, and I could hear the strain in his voice when he said that. I knew that tone from my old group. It's the sound someone makes right before a bad plan becomes a tempting one. When they finally stopped talking and drifted back toward their sleeping area, I crawled back into the loft and sat down on my tarp. I kept thinking about the way Mara kept glancing toward the dark corners of the store, as if she was hoping someone would leave a miracle on the shelf. The truth was that the place was full of supplies if you knew where to look, but most of it was buried behind infected bodies, collapsed beams, and piles of ruined packaging that turned into noisy traps if you stepped wrong. I had made dozens of quiet paths through those areas, but I never marked them clearly. They were for me, no one else. If anyone else tried navigating them without knowing exactly which tile cracked under pressure or which beam swung loose at the touch, they'd end up dead in minutes. That wasn't something I could change. I wasn't going to teach anyone to follow the same routes I used, but I could still do something. I gathered a small stash of things from my personal supply. A bag of rice that still smelled fine, a packet of powdered soup mix, 2 cans of vegetables, 1 plastic container of raisins that had hardened but wasn't spoiled, and a strip of dried beef I had rationed for emergencies. It wasn't a huge haul, but it looked like something a stressed survivor would hide and forget about. I knew the group didn't need to see my hand in it. I just wanted the kid to get food without causing suspicion. I wrapped everything in an old sweatshirt, then shoved it into a shallow cardboard box with a torn corner. It had the right amount of worn edges to pass as someone's hidden cache. I waited until the group left their usual morning spot to scout the bathroom corridor. Once they were out of sight, I dropped down from the loft's rear hatch, moved through the rafters above aisle 4, and climbed down near the broken freezer units where Caleb liked to sit when he was alone. There was a stack of flattened cardboard he used as a makeshift drawing surface. I slid the box into place between 2 fallen signs and scratched my symbol on the nearby metal beam. It was small, faint, and fast, just enough for someone who had seen it before. I didn't linger. I returned to the rafters before anyone came back. Half an hour later, the boy walked through again. He crouched near the drawing corner and saw the box almost immediately. He didn't open it at first, just stared at it, then glanced upward, then looked around the aisles like he wasn't sure whether someone was nearby. Eventually, he pulled the box into his lap and checked the contents. He didn't shout for the others or alert anyone. He closed the box, tucked it under his arm, and carried it back toward Mara with a steady pace. I stayed hidden and watched her pull him close and look inside. She didn't celebrate. She didn't panic. She only nodded and touched her forehead with her knuckles like she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Maybe both. I didn't need thanks. I just needed them to have one less problem. After they settled again, I went back to my loft. I sat against the insulation and checked my fuel supply. I keep my burner in a locked drawer built into the corner of the platform. The lock is just a bent metal latch held together with stripped wire, but it works. When I lifted the burner out and tipped it, I heard nothing inside. A few more shakes confirmed what I already suspected. It was empty, and the spare canisters I kept under the tarp were empty too. That was a problem I couldn't ignore. Without fuel, I couldn't boil water. Without boiling water, I'd have to rely on bleach purification for everything, and that runs out faster than you expect. I also couldn't cook the staples I relied on. Eating only cold food would work for a while, but not forever. I opened my supply inventory to check what else I needed to replenish. I was down to 4 cans of reliable food, 2 jars of lard, and 1 sack of oats. That would hold me for a couple of weeks if I stretched things thin, but the longer I waited, the harder it would be to take from the infected side of the store without risking crossing paths with the group. I didn't want them noticing missing items or hearing noise from that direction and thinking someone was scavenging behind their backs. I needed to go when they were asleep, when the infected were less active, and before the next cold front made the tile floors so brittle that every step echoed like broken stone. The idea of going back into the southeast zone irritated me more than it scared me. I've survived so long because I follow my routes exactly, but the infected shift positions over time. Bodies fall, shelves shift under their weight. I have to adapt every time I make a run. One mistake and the whole quiet system collapses. But I didn't have a choice anymore. I needed more propane, more long-lasting food, and maybe a few medical supplies if I could get to the backroom cabinet. I took out my cart, the silent one I built, and checked the wheels for debris. One of them barely turned. I scraped out a wad of twisted hair, dust, and something that looked like dried glue. The wheel spun again. Good enough. The group settled down for the evening later than usual. I heard Rick and Lainey still talking about plans for clearing the stockroom. Mara didn't join them. She was focused on Caleb. I watched the shadows shift behind the pharmacy shelves while they ate from the box I left. I didn't recognize all the sounds, but I knew the rhythm of a family sharing something scarce. That was enough to make me pause before I prepared to leave. As the store finally quieted, I crawled to the edge of the loft and looked at the path leading toward the southeast breach. It was darker than usual, which meant the infected might be dense there tonight. But I was out of options. Quiet nights are the best nights to move. I lowered myself onto the top of an undamaged rack and crouched there for several minutes, adjusting my grip on the padded cart handle and letting my eyes adjust fully. The store is different at night. The air changes, the smell thickens, and the silence feels heavier. I don't romanticize it. It's just the way decay settles indoors. Without the group's movement or the sunlight leaking through the broken walls, the whole place turns hollow. Every object looks sharper and more dangerous. I waited until I could see the outlines clearly enough that I wasn't guessing at distances. When I was sure the group was asleep, or at least not watching the aisles, I began my run. I moved slow, testing each tile. The floor shifts a little every month. When the infected push into the shelving, the whole structure leans in new directions. You only learn that by nearly getting crushed twice and memorizing the feeling of unstable ground. I reached the hardware aisle first, the place where I kept my silent cart tucked behind 3 fallen toolboxes. I pulled it out carefully, kept the wheels raised for the first few feet, and only let them down when I reached the mat of rubber doormats I laid months ago to keep sound down. This run wasn't about speed. It was about not being heard. The path toward the southeast breach is long and jagged, crossing through 6 aisles that are partially intact, and 4 that are half collapsed from a shelving domino that happened long before I got here. The breach pulls cold air inward, so you can always feel the direction even without looking. Tonight it felt colder than usual. That meant wind from the east. Wind scatters scent, but it also drags the groaning of the infected across the tile in unpredictable ways. Sound that used to travel north suddenly curves west. That alone has killed more people than bites. I passed the spot where Reese died. I don't linger there anymore. I just avoid the tile that still dips inward where his blood dried. The lights above that row broke months ago, so the shadows are deep and unhelpful. I used the metal edge of the cart as a guide, feeling each shift with my fingertips and stopping whenever I sensed weight on the opposite side of the aisle. The infected don't breathe loudly, but they scrape. The sound is constant, low, and easy to miss unless you've trained yourself to separate it from the wind. When I reached the sporting goods area, I crouched and checked between the shelves for movement. The infected gather there sometimes because of the wide space and the broken floor. Tonight, I saw 3 figures near the far wall. They weren't moving much, just swaying slightly, like their bodies were following some old impulse they no longer understood. One of them had a torn jacket that flapped every time the breeze from the breach hit. I waited until their rhythm steadied into something predictable. Then I nudged the cart forward and hugged the shelves so tightly my shoulder ached from the angle. The closer I got to the breach, the stronger the smell got. Not death. Death dries out over time. This was the stink of bodies that hadn't finished rotting yet, trapped in cold weather long enough to stay intact, but not enough to stay clean. The southeast area is always crowded with that smell. It's the first thing that hits new scavengers before their courage drains. It's one of the reasons the store stayed untouched for so long. I reached the cracked tile near the breach and stopped dead. Ahead of me were at least 15 infected, some standing, some slumped over, some wandering in slow circles. The noise from the outside must have drawn them inward earlier in the day. Wind carries sound strangely here, bouncing off the collapsed helicopter frame outside. Sometimes it fools them into thinking food is near. I watched them for a long minute, counting their movements and angles. There was a gap near a fallen ceiling beam that I could slip through if I kept the cart angled and didn't hit any debris. Beyond that was the back corridor that led to the stockroom access hatch. I didn't need to enter the stockroom itself. I just needed the storage crates left near the wall, where the helicopter's impact pushed equipment outward. I had scouted those crates months ago. I remembered one of them held portable camping supplies. I prayed the propane canisters were still intact. If not, I'd be relying on cold meals and untreated water for the next few weeks. I made my move when the wind shifted again. I eased the cart between 2 bodies that didn't notice me at all. Their eyes were glazed, cloudy, unfocused. Slow infected are predictable when they're calm. It's the sudden noise you fear, not their reach. I kept low, pushed forward, and reached the beam. When I ducked beneath it, I felt old grit fall into my hair and onto my collar. Once I cleared it, I reached the crates. I pulled the cart close to avoid scraping anything. I opened the first crate quietly. Empty. Someone had gotten to it before me, or the contents had been something useless. I opened the second. Packaging, plastic tarps. Good for cold months, but not what I needed right now. I opened a third crate and froze. There they were, 4 small propane canisters, dusty but sealed. I grabbed all 4. I also found a box of survival rations that hadn't been touched, heavy biscuits, powdered drink mixes, dense snacks that tasted awful but lasted years. I didn't take everything. That's a greedy habit that gets people careless. I took enough to fill 1 layer of the cart. The rest stayed. Maybe I'd come back for it later. Maybe the group would need it someday. It didn't matter yet. I secured my haul and quietly backed away. The return trip is always worse. The infected sense movement faster when you pass them the second time. It's not intelligence. It's just some twitching reflex that reacts to shifts in air. One of them turned slightly when I passed. I stopped breathing for a moment and gripped the cart. The infected didn't take another step. It just lifted its chin once, then settled again. I moved when its body sagged backward. When I reached the halfway point, the pressure in my chest finally eased. The sporting goods area looked clearer than before, and the shadows near aisle 10 were empty. By the time I reached the loft ladder, the sky outside had started to pale with early morning light. I lifted the cart into my platform in sections, set everything neatly, and sealed the hatch behind me. Once I had all the new supplies organized, I finally sat down. My hands were trembling. Not fear, just cold and exhaustion. I wrapped myself in my blanket and waited for my breathing to steady. I hadn't noticed how hungry I was until I smelled the mix of old flour and metal coming from the ration box. I forced myself not to tear into it. First rule: never eat immediately after a run. That's when mistakes happen. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm that almost felt controlled, even though nothing in this world ever stays predictable. The group below kept to their routines. Rick still scouted the aisles with his broken shotgun, sometimes tapping its handle against shelves, as if it helped him think. Mara spent much of her time sorting supplies, rearranging them into neat piles that made little strategic sense but seemed to calm her. Lainey wandered more than the others, exploring odd corners and sometimes stopping to stare at the collapsed roof section like she was imagining ways to rebuild it. Caleb stayed quietly productive. Every morning he stacked cans into patterns, or dragged small pieces of cardboard into new shapes, or tried to patch holes in plastic crates. Watching him work reminded me that kids adapt faster than adults. They don't pretend the world should be anything other than what it is. I kept helping when I could. Small interventions, nothing visible. I tightened screws in a shelf to keep it from tipping near their sleeping area. I cleared a path behind the cleaning aisle when I knew Mara was repeatedly trying to reach the back corner for spare blankets. I moved a stack of bottled water closer to an accessible path, leaving just enough debris so it didn't look staged. I never helped too much. If a thing looked too easy, the group would suspect someone was nearby. People don't trust luck when they're starving. They also don't appreciate miracles without faces. My own supplies stabilized. With the propane bottles, I boiled water more regularly and stretched my food supply with rationed portions. I kept my body weight steady, cleaned myself every 3 days, and maintained the roof wash area. When the weather was clear, I spent long hours watching the distant highway through the rooftop ventilation blind spot. Some afternoons I saw no movement at all, not even infected. Other days, I caught glimpses of travelers passing quickly, usually in pairs, walking with heads down and weapons in hand. No one approached the store. No one even slowed. People learn from rumors faster than from experience, and the rumor about this place was always the same. Too many infected, too much noise risk, and a collapsed military camp full of bodies that carried disease even before the outbreak. There were nights when the infected density swelled again around the breach. They drifted in from the tents like a slow tide, piling into the store's front aisles until I could smell their rot through the ceiling vents. I kept my routes memorized and used them sparingly. I didn't need another big run yet. The propane could last a while if I used it carefully, and the food stash remained stronger than at any point in the last year. The group below never tried clearing the stockroom. They kept talking about it, making plans, drawing diagrams on scraps of cardboard. But the conversations always stalled when they remembered the noise problem. I was relieved by that. If they attempted it wrong, the entire store would turn into a death trap within minutes. It was around the 4th or 5th week when things started to shift again. The infected presence outside began to thin out. I noticed it first during my rooftop checks. The usual crowd near the tent camp had drifted east, leaving only scattered figures wandering between poles and scraps of tarp. Something had pulled them away. It wasn't sound. I would have heard anything big enough. It wasn't scent either. The wind hadn't changed. That kind of pattern usually means living people pass through. Infected react more intensely to human movement than anything else. And if the infected were thinning out, it meant someone else had entered the area. I spent the next 2 days watching more carefully. Every time I saw a shadow near the road or a faint blink of metal through the dust, I tracked it. At first, it was nothing, just shifting light or animals moving across abandoned cars. But on the 3rd evening, as the sun dropped behind the old freeway overpass, I spotted a set of figures approaching from the east. They were too organized to be random survivors. They moved in a line, heads turning in practiced arcs. One in front, 2 behind. Then another 2 at the back who carried themselves with a posture that didn't come from scavenging. It came from discipline, ex-military, or something close. They didn't come straight toward the store. They circled wide, scouting the perimeter like they were measuring the risk. One of them held a suppressed rifle. Another carried a machete strapped to his thigh. A third had patches of armor pieced together from police gear and sports pads. Their formation wasn't sloppy, and the way they signaled each other with hand gestures made my stomach tighten. If they knew how to move like that, they weren't harmless. Discipline plus scavenging gear usually meant a hybrid crew, ex-military strays mixed with gang types who had learned fast in the early months. They didn't enter the store that night. They walked the perimeter, checking angles, peering through cracks. One of them bent down to examine footprints near the north entrance. I knew they weren't mine. My paths never leave tracks. They were Rick's from 2 days earlier when he checked for fresh air drafts in that direction. The scout pointed the tracks out to another man, and the conversation was short but serious. They weren't here by accident. They were tracking someone or scouting for a base. Either way, their presence was a problem. I pulled the tarp tight around my rooftop corner and didn't move for almost an hour. The men surveyed the area like they were planning something. Then they left, heading toward the campground ruins. I watched until they disappeared behind the wreckage of the helicopter tail. My mind was running hard the whole time. Ex-military scavenger groups rarely passed up a big structure like this. If they didn't enter now, they would return later, and they would make noise when they came back. Noise meant infected. Infected meant chaos. Chaos meant Rick and his family would be pulled straight into a fight they couldn't win, and I'd be trapped in the loft with no exit. I never liked feeling cornered. I liked it even less when other people were part of the calculation. The next day, the group downstairs continued their routine without noticing the new danger. Rick complained about a shortage of matches. Mara tried to stretch a ragged blanket by stitching it with thread she found in the craft aisle. Lainey watched the eastern windows with more caution than usual, maybe sensing something but without enough information to say why. Caleb built another can tower by the pharmacy and knocked it over twice before giving up and drawing shapes on the dusty floor tile. I spent that entire day listening for any sign the hostile group had returned. Every shift of wind made me tense. Every distant clatter could have been a recon test. I stayed close to the loft vents, ready to pull my traps if needed. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. The longer I helped these people survive, the more invested I became in their chances. And that meant thinking like an outsider looking in. If I were part of that military gang crew, how would I take this supermarket? They would come at night. They would use distraction. They would funnel the infected inward to flush survivors out of hiding. They would assume anyone living inside had resources worth taking. By dusk, the store felt too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from anticipation. The infected near the breach were strangely inactive, most of them standing still with their heads tilted as if listening for cues. Even the wind felt muted, drifting across the store without the usual rattle. I stayed low, kept my pry bar close, and waited. I didn't need long. Near midnight, I heard careful footsteps in the front corridor, the soft crunch of gravel under boots, and the low murmur of male voices trying to hide their tone. It was the hostile group, returning exactly the way I predicted. They didn't sneak in through a side door or try to climb over the shelving. They came straight through the widest opening like they owned the place, confident enough that stealth didn't matter. I crawled to the edge of the loft and angled myself over the vent grill. From there, I could see Rick rising to his feet near the pharmacy. He had his shotgun pointed at the floor, not the intruders, and that told me everything. He wasn't stupid. He knew he wouldn't win a fight with that broken thing. Lainey stood beside him with her hands raised shoulder height. Mara shielded Caleb behind a shelf, trying to keep him out of view. The intruders walked in like they had done this before. 5 men, all armed. One carried an old military rifle with a taped stock. Another swung a club made from a broken table leg. 2 of them had knives strapped to their chests. The last one, the oldest, looked like he might have been a real soldier at one point. He had the bearing for it. Straight spine, deliberate steps, and the habit of scanning corners without moving his head too much. They spread out, not afraid of noise or infected. They must have cleared some outside before entering. The leader took one look at Rick and laughed, not out of humor, but out of disbelief that someone like him was defending anything worth taking. He asked where the food was. Rick tried to lie, saying they were barely surviving and didn't have anything extra, but the leader cut him off by stepping forward and striking him hard across the jaw with an open hand. Rick fell to the ground and groaned, pressing his hand against the side of his face. Mara started toward him instinctively, but one of the intruders raised his knife and warned her back without a word. Caleb froze. The leader told them they were wasting his time. He said he knew there were supplies in the closed section. He told Rick to stop pretending he didn't see the pallets. He added that he had watched this group for days and knew they weren't starving enough to leave that area untouched without a reason. Rick hesitated, and the leader grabbed him by the collar and dragged him to his feet. Then he told him that if the group wanted to stay alive, they would have to start earning it. He said they would have to sneak into the infected zone, clear whatever they needed to, and bring the goods back. He said he wasn't going to risk his own men on a death trap, but he would gladly let desperate people do it for him. Mara shouted at him, begging him not to force them into that section. She said it wasn't possible, that there were too many infected, that they didn't have enough weapons or noise traps to handle even half of what was in there. The leader didn't care. He didn't yell back. He didn't need to. He walked over to her, grabbed her by the wrist, and warned her that if they wanted to keep her alive, she would cooperate. He didn't touch Caleb, but the message was clear. If they refused, he would escalate. Lainey stepped forward then, trying to deflect the attention away from Mara. She said they would help gather supplies if they were given time. The leader smirked like he'd heard the line before. He told her they didn't have time. He said his group needed food immediately, and either these people helped, or he took the woman with him as leverage. He pointed at Mara. Then he added that if food didn't show up by morning, he would take the boy too. Something in me tightened when I heard that. Up until then, I'd been watching with the same controlled distance I used to keep from getting emotional about anything. But hearing that threat pushed me back into a memory I'd buried so deep I almost forgot the shape of it. I saw my brother in the stairwell again, crawling toward the drop with blood on his sleeve. I remembered the sound of boots approaching behind us, and the officer who shoved us back when we tried to get help. I remembered how helpless I felt. That same helplessness tried to rise up now. I couldn't let it. The conversation continued below, but their voices blurred into noise. I wasn't focusing on the words anymore. I was studying their formation. The leader was closest to Rick, holding him upright. 2 intruders stayed near Mara and Lainey. The other 2 wandered with restless energy, tapping metal displays with their blades, checking corners like kids in an abandoned house. Their alertness wasn't great. Their arrogance made them sloppy. If they found my traps too soon, it would expose me. But if they stayed unaware, I could use that ignorance later. The leader finally released Rick and shoved him backward. Rick steadied himself but didn't fight back. He asked what would happen if they refused. The leader shrugged and said he would take both women and the boy. He commented that they looked healthy enough to make the walk back to wherever he came from. He didn't seem to care about any resistance. He thought he owned the room already. That overconfidence was the only advantage I had. The intruders didn't stay long. They warned the family that they would return at dawn and expected the supplies ready, or at least an attempt underway. They mentioned that if the group tried to run, they would follow the trails and bring more men next time. Then they left through the front hole in the wall like they hadn't even stepped foot in a place full of infected shadows. Their footsteps faded into the night. I waited until every sound was gone before moving. Rick collapsed onto a crate once they were out of sight. Mara inspected his face gently. His cheek had swollen already. Lainey paced in tight circles, muttering to herself and pulling at her jacket sleeves. Caleb sat close to Mara, not touching her but leaning toward her direction, unsure whether he should act brave or scared. That's how kids look when they're pretending they're fine. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched. He kept glancing toward the dark aisles, but didn't see me watching. I stayed hidden for a long time after that. I thought through every angle. If I intervened openly, they'd panic. If I stayed out of it, the intruders would take the women and the kid, and Rick would get himself killed trying to stop them. That wasn't acceptable. I wasn't going to watch this unfold the same way I watched my brother die. I wasn't looking for redemption. I just wasn't going to repeat a mistake. I crawled back toward my supplies and opened the storage locker where I kept my tools. My traps were already positioned across key aisles, but I needed new ones. Silent ones. Things that would slow the intruders without drawing infected. I laid out heavy fishing line, screws, small hooks, and 2 metal rods from a broken mop I saved months ago. I would need to rig them fast and position them before dawn. The intruders thought they were walking into a weak group. They didn't know the store belonged to me. They didn't know how many ways it could be turned against them. And they didn't know I wasn't going to give them anything they demanded. My mind kept circling around one problem. If I stayed hidden and triggered everything myself, the intruders would assume someone was living here, and they wouldn't stop searching until they found me. Rick's family would end up trapped in the crossfire or cornered between the infected and the armed men. I couldn't let that happen. Their only chance was to be gone before the fight started. But if I warned them openly, they'd panic or shout or try to argue. I needed one person who could carry the message without breaking. One person who would listen without demanding answers. That meant the boy. I waited until the store settled into the deep quiet that comes right before dawn. Rick dozed against a wall with a blanket draped over his legs and a piece of cloth pressed to his bruised cheek. Mara lay curled beside Caleb. Lainey had taken first watch hours earlier and had fallen asleep sitting upright with her back against a display. The whole group was exhausted from fear and uncertainty. That was the opening I needed. I crept through the rafters above aisle 8, lowered myself onto the top of a tall shelf, and then dropped silently to the floor behind a row of plastic storage bins. I didn't go straight to the kid. I waited, listening carefully. Breathing patterns mattered. A sudden shift meant someone was waking. I needed an angle that kept me hidden until the exact moment I chose. After a few minutes, Caleb rolled onto his back, eyes still closed. Mara turned toward him, but didn't wake. That was the moment. I slipped forward, covered the distance slow but controlled, and knelt beside the boy before he stirred. When he finally blinked awake, I moved fast. I put one hand over his mouth, another around the back of his head. Not rough, just firm enough to stop a scream from slipping out. His eyes shot wide, panic rising in them. I leaned in close and whispered against his ear that he didn't need to be afraid. I told him quietly that I had been watching over him for weeks, giving him food, clearing paths, and keeping his family safe. I told him he had seen my symbol more times than he realized, and that I wouldn't hurt him. His breathing steadied a little. His eyes didn't soften, but they stopped darting for help. That was enough. I whispered that I was going to move my hand, and that he needed to stay completely silent. When I let go, he didn't scream. He just stared at me with the kind of focused attention only scared kids have. I told him he was old enough to understand what was happening, and that no one else in his group could handle this talk right now. I said the intruders weren't going to leave them alone, and that waiting or begging wouldn't change anything. He nodded once, tiny and controlled. I explained everything in a low voice. I told him about the traps I'd set, the infected routes I could open, and the way noise would spread through the aisles once the intruders walked into the first trip line. I told him that the hall would flood with infected the second the walls rattled, and that the fight would be fast and ugly. I wasn't going to sugarcoat it. I said his group needed to be far away when it happened. I pointed to the northern corridor. I said they had to leave through the broken staff door behind the office storage cabinets. I explained where the floor tiles dipped, where the infected rarely walked, and which escape route led toward the cleaner outskirts. He listened without interrupting. When I paused to see if he understood, he nodded again. I told him exactly when to go. I said that as soon as the intruders returned at dawn and demanded his group move toward the stockroom, they were to pretend to agree. I said they needed to walk slowly and keep the men distracted. Then, when I triggered the first trap deeper inside the store, the intruders would turn. That was when Caleb had to tell his family to run. Not think, not argue, run. I warned him that if they waited even a minute too long, the infected would flood the center aisles and bury the exit. I added that he couldn't tell them about me. Not my name, not my hiding place, not anything. I said I wouldn't run with them or explain the rest. I had my own reasons. He was old enough to hear that without breaking down. I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked toward his mother for strength. He absorbed the words with a steadiness far beyond his age. I told him he had to be the one to speak. His parents would try to argue with him otherwise. Before I left, I added one last thing. I said that I had been giving them supplies since they arrived, and that I wasn't asking for anything in return. I only wanted them out before everything went bad. Caleb swallowed and whispered that he wouldn't betray me. His voice cracked, but the promise was real. I pressed 2 fingers lightly against his shoulder in silent thanks, then slipped backward into the shadows before his mother could stir. I climbed the nearest rack, pulled myself up through the rafters, and moved fast toward the loft. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the confusion or fear in his expression any longer than I had to. I had done my part. Now I had to finish the rest. The next hour was a blur of preparation. I reinforced the trip lines in aisles 3 and 7. I dragged a rusted metal cart frame closer to the breach to create a louder collapse point. I positioned the mop rods across key walkways so that if someone stepped wrong, they'd fall hard and hit the shelving. I re-anchored a pallet against a column so that it would topple at the right nudge. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just enough noise in enough corners to wake the infected by the dozen. Dawn crept in slower than usual. The grey light filtered through the broken windows, spreading across the debris. I stayed hidden in the rafters, watching every movement below. Eventually Rick woke, holding his jaw in pain. Mara rubbed Caleb's back gently, unaware that her son had been given the most important job of his life. Lainey cursed under her breath as she forced herself awake and checked the aisles for threats. If she noticed Caleb's distracted look, she didn't comment. Footsteps sounded outside. Heavy boots, multiple pairs. The intruders were back. They entered with the same swagger as the night before, calling out demands and telling Rick to get moving. The leader pointed toward the stockroom and shouted that he wanted progress right away. Rick hesitated. Mara started to speak. Lainey grabbed her arm to keep her quiet. Caleb stepped forward before anyone else could say anything. His voice cracked once, but he spoke with force, telling his parents they needed to go now, exactly the way the intruders wanted. The leader laughed and waved for them to start walking. Rick whispered something to Caleb, probably pleading for an explanation, but the boy shook his head hard. He kept walking. The intruders followed behind, shouting insults and tapping their weapons against shelves. Then it began. The first trap snapped in aisle 3, pulling a ladder down into a metal rack. The noise carried. The infected near the breach stirred and began drifting inward. The intruders froze, startled. The leader ordered his men to check the noise. Another trip line triggered 2 aisles over, letting a stack of loose cans roll across the ground like scattered gravel. That was enough. The infected roared as they surged toward the sound. The intruders panicked. They ran in different directions, waving their weapons, shouting at each other to regroup. One of them slipped on the fishing line and slammed into a shelf so hard the entire top row collapsed. More noise, more infected. The chain reaction spread across the store, waking every dormant body behind the collapsed wall. I watched from above as the aisles filled with movement. The intruders fought, but they weren't ready for chaos this dense. Their discipline vanished the second things didn't go their way. Meanwhile, Rick's family escaped exactly as planned. I tracked them through the rafters, watching them slip toward the northern corridor. Caleb stayed ahead of them, shouting directions he should not have known, guiding them around the cracked tiles and loose shelves. Mara clutched his arm, terrified, but moving. Lainey cleared debris from their path without hesitation. Rick stumbled once but recovered. They reached the broken staff door and vanished into the cold morning air. The infected flooded the center aisles. The intruders were buried fast. I didn't cheer or feel vindicated. It was survival, nothing more. The store shook with the weight of the bodies moving through it. Shelves fell. Displays rattled. The hall lost whatever safety it once had. I backed away from the rafters and returned to the loft, knowing the place I had lived for so long would never be quiet again. Before leaving, I paused at the hatch one last time. Below me, the supermarket was becoming a maze of moving shadows, groans, and collapsing metal. Through the noise, I heard something faint. A woman's voice. It was Lainey. She was outside now, calling into the empty building. She shouted, "We'll do everything you said. Thank you for keeping us alive. Thank you for everything." Her voice cracked, but she didn't run away until the infected roared again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I closed the hatch, grabbed my pack, and moved toward the rooftop exit. The supermarket was finished. My loft was finished. But the family was alive. The kid had kept his promise, and the world outside was waiting for me again. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership: Carlos Herrera, The Great Anywho, Jay Dalla, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, William Blackwell, TJR. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.